returning to the basics of drug action, the other kind of effect you might get is usually going to be referred to it as adverse effects or adverse reactions. These are also something that happens besides the therapeutic effect, but they tend to be more serious. These are things that can interfere with your life, can really make things difficult for you. You can get sick, or they could result in death. For instance, say you take an antibiotic that gets rid of the bacteria, but it has the side effect of mild nausea. However, after you've taken it for a few days, you end up breaking out in a rash, your skin starts to blister, and you end up in the hospital on a burn unit because you've developed a very rare condition called Stevens-Johnson syndrome that actually causes blisters and skin sloughing. That is an adverse reaction. It is a serious symptom that's come about because of that drug. They can be very unpleasant to the point where you need to quit taking the medication, or they can be life-threatening. And these are things that occur as a direct result of the drug that we know of. So hopefully all we're going to ever have is side effects, but sometimes you can have more adverse reactions depending on how your body reacts to that drug. Now, sometimes you might have a reaction that's known as an idiosyncratic reaction. If you have an idiosyncrasy, it usually means a trait that is common to you, that's sort of distinctive. You might say, he's a really nice person, but he's got a few little idiosyncrasies. Those are kind of strange or unique responses to situations. Well, this is true of drugs. Sometimes you will end up having a very unique or unpredicted response. This is a response that didn't show up in the majority of people that the drug was tested on. All of a sudden, you start taking the drug and then you have this weird reaction. And an example of this that I always tell my students, we were talking about Benadryl. A few years ago, there was a case that made the newspaper about somebody who robbed a business here in Knoxville in a real inept manner. Like, they went in through the roof and did a huge amount of property damage and possibly even a little injury to the burglar himself, and he was caught. And his defense was that he never would have robbed the store, but he was taking Benadryl and it made him act in that antisocial manner. Now, the jury didn't buy it, and the person got some kind of a penalty and probation, something like that, I think. But had it been true, had he been a perfectly upstanding, law-abiding citizen until he took some Benadryl, that would have certainly been an idiosyncratic reaction, because it was unique, it was weird, and it was definitely unpredicted, because most people take Benadryl and most people don't go around robbing stores because of it. So nobody really believed that the Benadryl defense, but had it been true, if it really was true, then that would definitely be idiosyncratic. But many times you'll have a reaction that isn't commonly seen, but it continues, and the healthcare provider just finally says, well, it must have been the med, let's stop it and try something else. But it's unique to that person. Another common allergic response, or another common response, not really common, it's a abnormal action, but a lot of people claim to have allergies, is an allergic response, or what we call a hypersensitivity reaction. An allergic response is different from a side effect in that a side effect just happens because of how the drug works on the body, but a hypersensitivity or allergic reaction happens because your immune system responds to the drug as a foreign invader and tries to mount an action against what it perceives as a foreign antigen. The most serious form is anaphylactic reaction, in which the whole entire circulatory system shuts down. The person has blood pressure dropping. Initially, the heart rate rises to account for that, but then the heart just, can't go indefinitely, and they have complete circulatory collapse. Hopefully, medical care has been achieved before the person gets to that point. But there are some people who die of anaphylactic reactions, tragically. So many times, an allergic response or a hypersensitivity response is filed under an adverse reaction. It's more serious. It's going to require the person probably to not be able to take that drug, and it can potentially be fatal. So generally, when we ask what are the 3 basics of drug action, it's going to be therapeutic response, side effects, adverse effects, including sometimes the allergic response. And then the last response that we sometimes see with drugs is called a paradoxical effect. When something is a paradox, it means you have 2 ideas that are diametrically opposed to each other. So they can't exist together. So what happens many times is you'll take a drug and it creates the opposite effect from what's usually seen. So an example of this would be a person who takes Benadryl, but instead of getting very drowsy and sleepy, they get extremely wired. Like, it has the opposite effect on them. It just makes them hyper. And we often see this with children and cold medications because of children's immature makeup. A Benadryl given to a child might make them extremely hyper and very nervous, whereas, mom's taking it and she's fallen asleep next to the kid. So we see paradoxical effects sometimes with children and the elderly. And so you always have to remember that and sometimes you see it in regular people. I've got a friend who can't take Benadryl. It makes her jumpy and nervous, and she can't sleep. So she has a paradoxical reaction from what you would expect from the drug given to somebody else. Let's talk in the rest of this video about a concept called bioequivalence. Bioequivalent refers to similarities in a particular drug, and you see this in generic drugs. Now, what happens is that for a certain number of years after a drug is manufactured, average 17, it can be longer or shorter, a patent protects the financial interests of that drug. It says, this particular group of scientists has developed this drug and has been sponsored by this particular pharmaceutical company. So we're issuing the patent to these chemists who are working for this lab, or this lab and this company, and only that company can make the drug, and only that company can refer to it by its trade or brand name. Now, eventually that patent's going to come to an end. And if the drug has made a huge amount of money for that company, they might want to continue that. But usually after a drug's been out there for 10, 15, 20 years, they can make more money by selling the formula for that drug to other companies. Maybe the drug is no longer a really hot seller like it used to be, but it's still a good drug and other companies would like to make it, and so they can pay that original company for the patent. So what that company does is they make a bioequivalent. They are going to create a drug that is chemically identical to the original. And that's where you have brand name versus generic drugs. Now, when something is bioequivalent, their active ingredients have to be equivalent to the active ingredients in the former drug, the original drug. But there can be differences in the inactive ingredients. There can be slight differences in how it's put together or processed. And sometimes these can lead to patients noticing the difference in how the med works for them, or sometimes it will create a difference in how the person does on that drug. For instance, people who have seizures, if they find a medication that works for them, it is recommended that they keep taking that medication indefinitely because their body has had success with that particular seizure drug. And sometimes the insurance company will say, you know, we're not paying for that seizure drug anymore. It's very expensive. There's a generic equivalent, and you could take that for a lot cheaper. And so the person switches to the generic drug, and the active ingredient is the same, but there's a slightly different filler in the inactive ingredients that affects how quickly the drug breaks down and is available to the patient, and all of a sudden they start having seizures because their brain waves are not reacting to the drug the way it reacted to the original medication. And so sometimes you as a nurse, if you end up working for a doctor's office, you'll find yourself on the phone with insurance companies advocating for the patient to be able to take this particular kind of drug. I did case management for 3 years, and I spent a lot of time on the phone with insurance agents talking to them about why the patient should be allowed to have that particular drug. And sometimes the healthcare providers had to write letters or speak to the insurance company themselves. But that might end up being part of your job if you are working in a doctor's office or a clinic. You can get onto this website and read about generic medications versus the original medications on this link that I have right here to the FDA site.